the MCAT podcast, session number 170. A collaboration between the medical school headquarters and Next Step Test Prep, the MCAT podcast is here to make sure you have the information you need to succeed on your MCAT test day. We all know that the MCAT is one of the biggest hurdles you'll face as a pre-med, and we're here to give you the motivation and information that you need to know to help get you the score you deserve so you can one day call yourself a physician. Now, welcome to the MCAT podcast. My name is Dr. Ryan Gray, and I hope you are having a wonderful day. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast today. If you haven't yet, the one thing that you can do right now that would make my heart glow, if that's a saying, I don't know, is to share this podcast with your friends, with your pre-med advisor, or with anyone else who wants to listen. Again, go share this podcast. That is the best thing that you can do for us right now. We have another great podcast with Phil from Next Step Test Prep here today. And if you're looking for some more help with your MCAT test prep and you are looking at using full-length exams to do that, go check out Next Step Test Prep and their MCAT bundles that they have for full-length exams. I ask students all the time, what exams do you like the best? And in our Hangout, which if you're not part of, you should be at medicalschoolhq.net/group, if you ask in the Hangout, and students ask all the time, like, what are the best set of exams that I can use for the MCAT? Obviously, the AAMC is the first best, the second best, Next Step Test Prep. And you can save 10% off on those exams using the promo code MCATPOD. That's MCATPOD. Let's go and jump into our episode today. Phil back for some more MCAT podcasts. I hope you're off your coffee. You've seen the light side. You don't need that caffeine. Just kidding.
It's a
Who am I kidding?
not a de-stressor.
It's a eustressor. You've turned that distress into eustress.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Still need to make that t-shirt. So I want to continue. I think students are getting hopefully a lot of good value out of these where we're breaking down the MCAT outline, which is, we haven't really talked about it, or maybe we did at some point. This MCAT outline is really what all of the test prep companies work off of, right? It's Next Step, Kaplan, Princeton Review. Every test prep company out there, when they're creating their books, are like, okay, here's my outline for my book and or all the chapters and everything that really needs to go in it. The AAMC is providing this information. So
yeah, and the companies that aren't doing that should. In my mind.
Yes, they should.
This is something that I just work through this outline with all of my students when I'm like doing tutoring stuff or in the Next Step course. We just kind of like work through this outline, and like my students are killing it in psych. And this is all we're doing, is just making sure that they can come up with definitions in their own words with their own examples, focusing on what's the differences between this versus that. And if a student can talk about that, then they know their things cold. And like about 20% of my students that I'm doing one-on-one tutoring with are getting perfect scores in psych in the last year. And that's obviously like 20% of students are in the 99th percentile. Mathematically, that doesn't seem to make sense. But all that we're doing is just breaking down this psych outline, making sure people know it cold.
Yeah. Okay. So what are we going to continue with today?
So I figured we'd move past the realm of 6, right? We talked about 6A, 6B, 6C in the last 3 kind of meetings. So let's move into the realm of 7, where we start talking about behavior and like what's going on with why people act this way versus before we were talking about like emotions and like what's going on with like memory and things like that.
Okay.
So in section 7A, we're going to talk about like what kind of influences behavior. And there's all sorts of stuff in here. This is one of the most dense sections, section 7A. And so one of the things that students tend to get a little bit kind of confused with is personality and the theories of personality and talking through this. So there's several different people and several different ideas kind of going on behind this. And so this is where we start to get into like what's going on with Freud and Jung and B.F. Skinner and all these people that were talked about in my Psych 101 course. And like, what exactly do I need to know about these guys when it comes to the actual AAMC exam? So talking about the theories of personality, you can't ever get out of psychology without talking about the psychoanalysts, right? Because when people think psychologist or psychiatrist, they basically think Freud, right? And so Freud is the psychoanalyst, right? Like he's the guy that we build everything around in terms of the psychoanalytic perspective. So the psychoanalytic perspective is the idea that what's going on with you needs to be analyzed because you're not even aware of it. So if I go in and I went down and sat down and was going to talk to Freud, and I'm like, I'm having a hard time at work. I think that my boss doesn't really understand what stuff I'm capable of. And they keep giving me jobs that are not well suited for my particular skill set. I'd be really good at this, but they don't want to instead they're making me do this other thing. Freud would say, shut up and tell me about your mother. Right. That's what he wants to know, because the psychoanalyst, the idea is you're not even aware of what's going on. You need to dive into the psyche. You need to be analyzed. There's things going on subconsciously, and we need to kind of pull those things apart. And so the psychoanalyst is this idea that we need to pull things. And so under theories of personality, the psychoanalytic perspective is that, a lot of this is happening kind of subconscious things that you're not aware of, right? Why am I a real jerk to these sorts of people? Well, these sorts of people remind me of my father, and that makes me angry. And so I'm a jerk to anybody with a beard and anyone over 6 foot tall, right? And why am I acting like this? And so another perspective would be the humanist perspective. And this is one of my favorite ones. This is what people think of normally when they think about a therapy session or something. So that if you were to sit down with a humanist and you're going through the spiel of my boss isn't recognizing what I'm good at and they're assigning me other stuff, the humanist would say, tell me more about that. How does that make you feel? Right. So the humanist perspective, the idea is that everyone essentially wants to be a good person, and they treat you as a patient-centric sort of therapy, where the patient is kind of the center and kind of driving where the therapy is going. The idea being that the patient knows better than anyone what's going on with the patient, right? Pretty much the opposite of the psychoanalytic perspective. So in the humanist perspective, we have Carl. Carl Jung is one of the big guys in that area. Also Maslow, what's going on with Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And both of these people are built around the idea of being self-actualized. And so that's a term. There's a lot of some things that the MCAT likes to test, like self-esteem, self-concept, self-ideal. And so self-actualization is one that we kind of need to be able to pull apart. Self-actualization is being the best version of yourself that you can be, being an actualized human. And most people are pretty familiar with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the biological needs at the bottom, working to other things as you move up. And so the self-actualize, it's really important to kind of drive home what this is, because a lot of people think about this in different terms. And maybe their definition of what is self-actualize isn't the actual definition of self-actualize when you're trying to come up with an example. So a lot of people think it means being successful and accomplishing a lot. And that's a big thing, maybe just within the realm of MCAT students. These people are very driven. They want to accomplish a lot. They want to leave their mark on society and make the world a better place. And that's what it means to be successful, to live a good life. But self-actualized actually just means becoming the best version of yourself. And that doesn't mean the most powerful, the most rich, right? The most accomplished. The best version of yourself might be, some guy that is a history teacher, and he, is a history teacher, and he coaches softball, and he sees his family, and he's really happy with his life. And every day, he can't imagine doing anything different. And he's self-actualized. He understands all of his needs are met. He's able to follow hobbies and fulfill his passions. And that's a self-actualized person. And under the humanistic perspective, this is what we're trying to do. And so personality-wise, Maslow has some things that kind of fit into this with the hierarchy of needs. The lowest need in this hierarchy is physical needs, right? I need food, I need water, I need shelter. After that comes safety, right? And so the idea here is if I'm not safe, like that's okay in my mind. That's okay for me if I don't care about that. If I'm more worried about physiologic needs. So if I am starving to death, I might go attack that rhino with a spear. That's probably a really stupid thing to do in terms of safety, but like I'm starving to death, right? And so that's a base need that I need to address. And that's much more important than safety at this point.
Yep.
But if all of my physiologic needs are met, then safety is like the next thing that I worry about, right? I got enough food, I got enough water, I got shelter, that sort of thing. So now I'm kind of worried about safety. And after that, you go into like social things, like you need to socialize with other people. And then you need, past the social is the ego and kind of like the like self-esteem and things like feeling good about yourself. That's what you're worried about after you've got like your social stuff kind of dealt with. And then after that's met, you reach self-actualization as the highest tier. So it's physical, security, like safety, social things, ego, and then self-actualization. And so according to Maslow, these are the things you have to kind of like go through here. So there's also like Carl Rogers, Carl Jung and Carl Rogers, a couple of the humanists. Carl Rogers has this idea that there are kind of like three versions of yourself. There's the ideal self, there's the actual self, and then there's how you see yourself, right? And those are three different things, right? Like, who do I want to be? Who am I? And who do I think I am, right? Like, those are three different things. So in order to have a healthy personality, according to Carl Rogers, those three things need to be completely overlapped, right? That, like, I want to be a charitable person. I think I'm a charitable person, and I actually am a charitable person, right? And that's what it means to have a healthy personality. Versus if one of those things is not overlapping, then you have some sort of like psychological distress going on. Like if I think that I'm very charitable and I think that I should be charitable, but I'm actually not, I'm actually a jerk. Like there's something going on there, right? Or perhaps more common, people who think that they should be charitable and actually are charitable, but don't feel like it. Right. Some sort of like imposter syndrome kind of thing going on here. Like I'm not actually as good as people think I am, even though I do all of this stuff and I want to be this person, but I'm not. Like there's some sort of psychological distress going in there as well. And so that's Carl Rogers, the like actual self, ideal self, and self-concept all need to be kind of overlapped in terms of personality.
Okay.
So after that, we have trait perspective. And this is what everyone's doing on Facebook, right? Like, which Hogwarts house are you, right? Or the Myers-Briggs, or, all of these, like the Big Five Enneagram.
Which Disney princess are you? Come on.
Yes. Yeah. That's the most important one, right? I'm definitely a Mulan, personally. So this sort of trait perspective, you have these different, these different psychological traits, and they all kind of get measured. And so this is how you determine if somebody is like what somebody's personality is. You have these different traits. Traits tend to stay stable over the course of a lifetime, right? They're not like a dialectic. They're not one or the other. They're not like a, what's the ones and zeros? Binary. It's not a binary thing. It's more of a gradual, like it's a gradation of things. And so like, how charitable are you? How much do you think about other people versus kind of like focused on yourself? And there's kind of like lots of ways. And so the trait perspective of personality is breaking things down over these different traits. And so some of the big views of this is like the ocean one, which is a measure of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So it's ocean: open, conscientious, extroverted, agreeable, and neurotic. And so you need to be able to kind of like recognize, like, you can be somewhere on the scale of like, how open are you, right? When you like sit down next to someone on the subway, do you just like start opening up about like what happened with your childhood friend who blah, blah, blah. And like, this is how I feel about my father and my mother and like my Uncle Bill, right? Conscientiousness is like, like how aware are you of, your impact on certain things. Extroverted versus introverted, that's pretty open for most people. Agreeableness, is somebody like, pessimist all the time, or are they very optimistic, right? It's kind of a cross there. And then we have neuroticism, which I think most people like, how much do you worry about things, right? This kind of goes into like, paranoid versus not paranoid. Are you somebody who worries about everything all the time? Or are you somebody who just kind of like goes with the flow? And that would be focusing on neuroticism.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff. And now I just feel like
That's a lot.
Just like avalanching vocab and things on students.
Yeah.
And so just kind of like focusing on like, what's going on with Freud. You need to be able to, something that's really important here is the MCAT is a test of recognition. It's not a test of recall. And this is something that I tell students a lot as they're studying. And so you don't need to be able to regurgitate all of these things, right? And just kind of like, draw Maslow's hierarchy from memory, in Latin or whatever. Like, you don't need to be able to do this, but you need to be able to, like, if you see something, you can kind of like recognize like, something seems off about this, or this seems right. Within the realm of, perhaps a better example, let's just like, examples are always the best way to learn of this, or best way to learn anything. So let's say that the MCAT asks you what cholesterol is, right? They're not going to ask you to draw cholesterol, right? That's because the MCAT doesn't work that way, right? So they're never going to ask you to draw cholesterol, which is good because I couldn't do it, right? I know I'd miss some chiral centers or something would be off there. But they might ask you like, which of these is a cholesterol derived thing? And so just kind of like looking at your 4 answer choices, you're going to see something that kind of looks like cholesterol, something that's a peptide, something that is like a strand of DNA, and something that's like a triglyceride, right? And you need to be able to recognize which of those looks like cholesterol. And that's much easier than recalling and being able to draw cholesterol from scratch, right? And so you want to be able to recognize these things. And so it's really important to be able to recognize what is a humanist perspective, right? That like patient-centric, like striving for self-actualization. What is the psychoanalytic perspective? That's the, like, there's something going on below the surface, right? What's going on, like underneath that needs to be analyzed. The trait perspective. This is focusing on, okay, there are certain traits that kind of define your personality. They might be like cardinal traits, things that are very, very important to you. Or they might be like secondary traits. Things that are like, yeah, this is a trait that I have, but it's not the most important thing in the world. So for me personally, like education's huge. It's one of my cardinal traits, right? That kind of drives my life, right? Is like talking to students and educating and learning things myself. I'm always on this kind of like search for knowledge, taking in and taking out information. Honesty. I mean, yeah, honesty's good, but it's not like one of my cardinal traits. It's not one of the things that drives me and makes me, like it's not why I get out of bed. I don't like roll out of bed. I'm like, today I'm going to tell the truth, right? Like hopefully I'll tell the truth, but like I roll out of bed thinking like, today I'm going to learn some awesome stuff, right? And like figure out something cool. How does a lava lamp work, right? I've been dying to figure that out. And so you need to be able to kind of like recognize these things. And so trait perspective is focused in on certain traits, right? And that's kind of what defines a personality. And, cardinal traits is something that the MCAT will occasionally ask. And so that's why I kind of like work in that vocab term there. What's the difference between a primary or a cardinal trait and like a secondary trait? So we have another couple of theories about this, and we'll kind of like recap and go rehash all of these like big picture at the end. But we also have the social cognitive perspective, which is the idea that who you are as like your personality has to do with like your environment and your behavior. And this is Albert Bandura's like big social cognitive, like triumvirate thing, where you have like what's going on inside your head, what's going on with your behavior, and what's going on with your environment. And all 3 of those things are affecting each other. So if I grew up in China, my personality is going to be different and my behavior is going to be different because my environment shapes those things. But also, growing up here, if I just changed my behavior and I started acting differently, then my environment is going to alter and how it responds to me. And also my personality is going to alter, right? And so I'm going to change, kind of like that fake it till you make it. If you like smile at everyone's going to start to be nicer to you. And you're actually going to feel better as a result. And so like that's an idea of like if you change your behavior, it actually changes what's going on the inside psychologically, as well as the environment around you. And so all three of these things, like the psychologic, the environmental, and the behavior are all kind of affecting each other, which is the social cognitive perspective, once again, championed by Albert Bandura. After that, we have biologic. So this is the idea that there's some biological stuff that's affecting personality. And this is something that is real. A lot of people want to imagine that, like, oh, he just needs to change this one thing and then his personality will be better or whatever. Like if you're like, like me, like an older sibling, like I'm always frustrated. I'm like, why doesn't my sister do this or my brother do this or whatever? This is what they should do. But like people are different and there's like biological reasons for this. One of the big easy ways to see this is drugs, right? Drugs will change people's personality, right? If somebody is taking a ton of testosterone, they're going to be a little bit angrier, right? Have a little bit less patience with things, roid rage. If somebody's taking Adderall, right? Like something happens there with the personality as well. And so psychologically and like personality wise speaking, there is some biological component to this. Having more or less of certain neurotransmitters or hormones are going to change the way that you think and act in the world around you. And so that's the biologic perspective of personality. The last one is the behaviorist perspective. And this is B.F. Skinner all the way. The MCAT loves to talk about B.F. Skinner because he's kind of all over the place on this outline. But the behaviorist perspective is the idea that your personality has to do with kind of like, what are you punished and rewarded for? B.F. Skinner pretty famously, talked about like, if you gave me a baby, I could raise that baby to be a pinnacle of humanity and honesty by rewarding him every time he tells the truth and punishing him every time he lies. Or I could do the opposite. And I could reward him every time he told a lie and punish him every time he told the truth. And that would turn him into a lying, deceitful person. And so there's something going on here with this, like rewards and punishments, this operant conditioning, the Skinnerian ideal that who you are personality-wise is actually, it's actually not up to you, right? There's how your environment responds to you is going to change how your personality develops. So these are the big six theories of personality, right? Psychoanalytic, humanist, trait perspective, social cognitive, biologic, and behaviorist.
Yeah. I would just miss these ones on the test. I'm like, I don't know. That's too much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's something to kind of like, once again, you recognize, right? Like social cognitive kind of makes sense with like socializing. So the idea there that like socializing changes your personality, like, yeah, that makes sense, right? And so that kind of fits. Biologic is really obvious, right? It's based in biology. Behaviorists, like anytime you hear anything behavior, you just think Skinner, right? Like operant conditioning, rewards and punishments. Psychoanalysts, Freud, right? Like you need to analyze the psyche to really understand what's going on there. Humanist, you treat people like humans. We all want to be the best we can be. We all want to be self-actualized, this patient-centric sort of thing. And then trait perspective is just all about traits. And so there's a lot of stuff, kind of like going into, maybe giving more information than a student needs to have in order to answer any question correctly. But remember, these answers or these questions are going to be multiple choice, right? So if they give you something about like, we really need to dive in and understand what's going on like below the surface subconsciously, oh, it's psychoanalytic. Right. And it's really easy to see that if you have multiple answer choices there. If they say like, how your environment affects your personality, it's social cognitive, right? How you're socializing kind of things going there. But if they use the word reward or punishment, that's no longer necessarily social cognitive. That's probably more behaviorist, because those are the words that B.F. Skinner liked to use, right? And so if I was rewarded for something or punished for something, it's definitely going to be a Skinnerian behavioral sort of theory.
Skinnerian.
That's one of my favorite
good
words.
Yeah, that's like I'm watching the new season of Jack Ryan, and they have a ship from Cyprus, and they call it a Cypriot ship. I'm like, oh, I never knew that word. Cypriot.
That's Cypriot and Skinnerian. If you can get those in Scrabble, you're going to get all the points.
It's all about Scrabble points.
Yeah, that's what I base everything on.
Okay. All right. So really, really, obviously, this one, these theories of personality, they're much more intimidating because it's a much bigger list. Like last week, I think it was last week where we were talking about like 2 things, right? Eustress and de-stress. 2 things, that's easy.
Yeah.
But this is like 6. How do we keep all of this straight? And I know you're saying, well, you don't have to like remember it to spit it back out. You don't have to like write down. You're not given a blue book and you have to write them all out and get them right 100%. It's just kind of recalling it and seeing it there. When we go back to, okay, what are the differences? Like what should a student be focusing on when they're looking at these 6 things? A lot of students are going to go into their Anki app or their flashcards, their physical flashcards and write this stuff out. What should they be focusing on when they're writing this stuff and learning it?
So some of the things you want to focus on are the people, right? Like who is the scientist behind this or behind that, right? So with psychoanalyst Freud, right? Like know that psychoanalyst is Freud. You got to have that down really well. Humanist, that is Rogers and Maslow, right? Like you got to make sure you know that. The social cognitive is Albert Bandura. Behaviorist is B.F. Skinner. Now those are things that like those terms come up later in other sections of the outline. And so like say, this isn't the only time they ever talk about the behaviorist perspective. There's a whole section in there about operant conditioning. But if you can kind of like make sure you know the people for them. I actually can't think of a big person for the biologic or trait perspective. I don't see the MCAT asking as much about like, you know, what person championed the trait perspective versus like they definitely would with psychoanalysts, right? Like that's Freud and like everyone's got to know Freud. Yeah. So I would know those people and like who did what, and then basically focus on like what causes the personality. So psychoanalyst, it's subconscious. Humanist, it's we all want to be good, right? And there's something kind of going on there. Trait perspective, certain traits. Social cognitive is the like environment, behavior, personality all interact with each other. Biological is biology. Behaviorist is rewards and punishments. And so just kind of like focusing in on like what's the kind of like foundational thing of like what separates this one from that one. One thing to kind of focus on is thinking about how the MCAT's going to ask us about these things. The psychoanalyst, like pretty much everyone's going to know that's Freud. And so I think that the MCAT, while they will expect you to know that, are maybe a little bit less likely to ask you about that. But they might ask you, because in the social cognitive and the behaviorist, how the world like treats you is going to change how your personality in both of those cases, right? So the behaviorist is the reward and punishment thing that like is going to change my personality. And the social cognitive is that the environment and my behavior are going to change that. And so you have to kind of like be careful and like, all right, what's the difference between these, right? So in the social cognitive theory, your personality changes your environment and behavior, and your behavior changes your personality and environment, and your environment changes, like all 3 of these things are interacting with each other, right? The behaviorist perspective doesn't do that. Right? Like your personality doesn't change what rewards and punishments you get according to, the classic Cypriot Skinnerian ideal. I actually don't think he's from Cyprus. I wish he was. And so in the behaviorist theory, it's just like, kind of like edicts from above of rewards and punishments. And that's actually changing my personality versus in the social cognitive, everything's kind of like a 2-way street. And so that's actually, if I was going to write an MCAT question, like really wanting to test like, all right, what students really know their theories of personality, that's probably the one I'd zero in on. Because students are going to get a little bit like tripped up because in both of those cases, the environment around you is going to change your personality. But in social cognitive, it also goes the other direction versus behaviorist is just these rewards and punishments.
All righty. Good stuff to take note of, to write down, to learn. It's just like, I think if students can think of this kind of stuff very similar to how they treat amino acids, right? Here's this one amino acid. I need to know the 2-letter, the 3-letter, the 1-letter, the structure, and just going through each of these and like, okay, I need to know the person, the dude that ruined my life by coming up with this theory in the first place that made me remember it. And then just going down the list of kind of those things you just went down to remember.
Yeah. And I know we didn't talk about memory this week in kind of like this episode, but there's something kind of nice to keep in mind. The idea that like your brain can only hold and like process and convert so much stuff to long-term memory in a short term, right? This is why it's better to study for 1 hour for 5 days in a row than it is to study 5 hours in one day. Because that one day you're not actually going to be able to retain as much because you have to convert all these short-term memories to long-term memories. And so looking at things like amino acids and these theories of personalities, I never really encourage a student to try to memorize all of them. Like, don't say I'm going to learn all of my amino acids today, right? Say I'm going to learn all my acidic amino acids today. It's pretty easy. It's aspartic acid, glutamic acid. I'll test myself at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'll have them down by the end of the day. I'll make sure I know them. The next day, add in the basic ones: lysine, arginine, histidine, right? And so you've worked those in. The next day, do all the polar ones, right? So serine, threonine, asparagine, glutamine. And so like each day you're memorizing like 3 or 4 amino acids. And then by the end of the week, you're done. Right. And that's going to be a lot easier and a lot less painful. Now you want to kind of like go back and review and like make sure when it comes to the basic amino acid day, I'm going to review the acidic ones as well. But I would do the same thing for these theories of personality, right? Just like one day I'm going to like just, work on psychoanalytic, make sure I know what the psychoanalysts are talking about, and then humanists, and then trait perspective and social cognitive, dialogical, and behaviorist. And there's a week and you've mastered all these theories of personality, and they're going to stay there, which is an important thing, because a lot of times people will, try to cram a bunch of information in. And once again, that works if your exam is on Friday and you're studying Thursday and I got to cram all this information in. But the MCAT is a much bigger set of knowledge and you have to work on it for months. And so just kind of like taking a second and being like, all right, I need to make sure that what I'm doing today, I'm still going to remember 3 months from now. And so breaking that up into smaller chunks is definitely going to help, which is basically the opposite of what I did today. Just like blazing through all of these, but it's important to kind of like get a big picture, before you kind of dive in depth to any one of these.
All right, there you have it. Another great episode for you. Again, if you're looking for some help with your MCAT prep and you are looking at full-length exams, look no further than Next Step Test Prep. Again, the second best exams out there. And usually you don't want to be second best, but when it comes to full-length exams, AAMC is the first best, and they now have 4 exams. And Next Step Test Prep also has 10 exams, and you can get a diagnostic and the first exam for free by signing up, or you can save 10% if you're looking for more exams by using the promo code MCATPOD. That's MCATPOD at nextsteptestprep.com. And don't forget to share this podcast with your friends, advisors, and more. I hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time here on the MCAT Podcast.
This is MedEd Media.